Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
And welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. You know, there are times, and I try to be open-minded, as honestly I do, when I just watch what's going on in the news, and I just want to scream for the highest mountaintop. Listen, Poilievre, would you just please put a cork in it? We're getting tired of your rants. Case in point, just a couple of days ago, and we're still about 2 weeks away from Parliament getting back to work, of course, in Ottawa. Of course, has these daily media conferences and scrums where he's, in many cases, just reiterating and rehashing and reintroducing a lot of the stuff from the Tory platform from the federal election, which, by the way, they lost. Paul remembers that, but you're not the Prime Minister, Pierre. But anyway, he was getting, the tough on crime stuff, etc., most of which, of course, we had talked about at the time in that election, was already struck down by the Supreme Court as against the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But nonetheless, he continues with and that little core of hardcore, Maple MAGA people just eat this stuff up. But so that's one thing. The other element, though, that he talked about, because he tends to go off on different tangents, was about his participation in Canada-U.S. relations. And I got a problem with this. And red flags were flying up all over the place as I listened to some of the comments here, where he says that he is now planning to, in his words, meet with American representatives and state the Canadian course of action and the case for Canada and Canada-U.S. relations. Please don't let that happen. That's really what I think the message we should be getting to right now, that this is not the guy we want in charge of what's going on between Canada and the United States, yet he seems to think that he should have a voice in this. Well, let me talk about whether or not Pierre Poilievre should have a voice. Of course, before the election, he was the opposition leader sitting in Parliament before he lost his seat in this election. And he had an opportunity. I mean, Carney did everything he could to try to bring everybody together. The whole theme was Canada team, the Team Canada approach to this. Everybody on the same side here. Put aside your partisan differences and let's just try to work to get the best opportunities here for Canada. Well, Poilievre didn't sign off on that. He just didn't want to be part of it. For whatever reason. I have my suspicions as to why he was that way. Now, of course, he's trying to pretend that it's about putting Canada first. I've mentioned this a 1,000 times, I guess. When it comes to dealing with politicians, the number one thing that I've always asked people to do is don't just listen to what they say, but watch what they do. And Poilievre is a classic example of that. I always want to put Canada first. He puts Poilievre first, and he puts conservative ideology way ahead of that, with certainly the tough on crime stuff. But even when it comes to Canada-U.S. relations, he has done nothing but bash Prime Minister Carney for the efforts that he has done. This is a guy, Poilievre, who paints the bleakest picture of this country right now. We're going to hell in a handcart, and it's all because of the Liberals, and he alone can fix this. By the way, we've heard this kind of rhetoric before, south of the border, and I know that he's uncomfortable with, he's the Maple MAGA guy here, but, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, I mean, let's consider exactly what Poilievre is here. I, as a Canadian, a concerned Canadian that wants to have the best opportunity for Canada and to have a strong trading and economic relationship with the United States, who's still our major partner, I don't want Pierre Poilievre anywhere near those negotiations because I don't believe that Poilievre has Canada's best interests at heart. He has his own political agenda. He says that he and his team have reached out to the Carney government numerous times to be part of this. Well, there's no proof of that. But the fact of the matter is, he says, and they haven't responded to it yet. Why would he be there? Why would he be there? This is a guy who's going to simply throw a monkey wrench into the works here to try to get any sort of a deal. All he wants to do is criticize Carney, and he's done this time and time again. One of the points he brought up, of course, during this media conference was, he's given up more than he should have and didn't get anything in return. Yeah, the digital service tax. Poilievre was against the digital services tax. He should be happy about the fact that Carney has decided, okay, scrap that. We're not going to use that anymore. But he doesn't let common sense and practicality or pragmatism, for that matter, enter into it. It's just anti-liberal, anti-liberal, anti-liberal. That's his mantra. That's Poilievre's mantra. This is a guy who is just bent on giving the worst case scenario. I wouldn't want him at the table. I wouldn't want him in the negotiating team because he simply does not seem to understand what we're trying to do here. He criticizes Carney for giving up too much during these negotiations. The Americans were the ones that walked away from the table. Do you remember that? They're the ones that simply said, we're not going to negotiate anymore unless you do this and do this and do this. Carney could have said, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to keep those counter tariffs in place. I'm going to do everything that we're doing right now. Well, then to be sitting across the table from nobody. And how is that going to help us? How is that going to enhance Canada's position? You've got to be intelligent and smart. And Carney is presenting the best possible option to Canadians, given the fact that you got people across the other side of the table during these negotiations that aren't playing fair. And they're simply changing the rules as they go along. It's very, very difficult. You need somebody who's smart, who's politically savvy, and who's got experience in international economics and politics to be able to handle this. Well, that is not Pierre Poilievre. Mark Carney is the one that Canadians seem to have the trust in, notwithstanding what Poilievre says. He wants to go down to Washington and present Canada's case. I don't think he understands Canada's case. He's going to get down there and present his own ideology, and he's going to go talk to Republicans, who are the MAGA people down on that south of the border. You want to go down there and have a coffee with them, Pierre? Knock yourself out. But don't, for the love of God, don't say that you're representing the Canadian government or the Canadian people, because you aren't. In any capacity. You don't understand the Canadian position here. And by the way, like I say, you're not the prime minister, all right? You're just a member of parliament. You're the leader of the opposition, and you live in that big house for free. We're paying for it, of course, as Canadian taxpayers. But that doesn't mean that you're involved in setting policy. Even in a minority government, he's talking about we introduce a law. No, you know what? The opposition parties don't introduce laws, Mr. Poilievre, and you know that. But it's all the phraseology that he's using here to try to indicate to Canadian people that he's got some leverage here and that he's actually in the policy-making chair. You're not. And by the way, we've mentioned this on previous podcasts, but I think it bears repeating now, that Canadians have spoken about this. We mentioned about the polls that have been done over the last couple of weeks about how Canadians are feeling about this. And let's be frank, we've said that we have had some setbacks in dealing with the Americans when it comes to tariffs and counter tariffs and things of this nature. And Poilievre, of course, is jumping all over that. And simply saying, well, you know what, Canadians must be upset, so I'm simply going to paint this black picture and say that it's all Carney's fault. Well, there was a survey that was just released by Bruce Anderson, of course, who is with Abacus Data. Bruce was a guest on the radio show many times, a very intelligent data organizer, somebody who's been involved in the pollster game for quite some time and getting the pulse of what Canadians are feeling like. They presented just a couple of weeks ago a list of 21 different questions about the economy, about Canadian lifestyle, about everything else, and said, how do you think the government's doing? The Carney government got passing grades on every one of them, 21 out of 21. Now, if I'm getting 21 out of 21 on a test, I'm doing pretty well. And Canadians feel that Carney is doing the best possible job given the circumstances. On all of these issues, on housing, on Indigenous rights, on dealing with the Americans, go right down the list, 21 different questions. And Carney gets a passing grade on each and every one of those. Now, it's not saying he's perfect, and nobody is saying he's perfect. But the reality here is that we understand the immense challenges that this government is facing right now, which is why when Carney talked about and continues to talk about a Team Canada approach to this, we thought, yeah, that's the only way we're going to get through this. You can't do this by dividing and conquering, because if you divide right now, you're not going to conquer anything. You're simply going to separate this country, and that's the worst possible thing that we could have right now. The premiers have bought into this. Even conservative premiers, people from different political stripes are also on Team Carney. They have their disagreements. We've talked about those on the podcast, and they're not doing that behind closed doors. We know that Doug Ford has some concerns about some of the policies that Carney's doing. Premier Moe does, certainly Premier Smith does. Webb Canoe was talking about some of the things that he's concerned about, but they have all of these discussions about, well, I don't think this is right. Maybe we should do this within the context of this is about Team Canada. Let's talk about this and hash this out. And that's the way they seem to be going on this. They're not getting everything they want all at once, but they seem to understand that the only way that we're going to deal with the Americans right now is with one voice. And that voice is not yours, Mr. Poilievre. It belongs to the Prime Minister, the guy that we put in charge, and the guy that we want to see at the negotiating table. And Poilievre just doesn't seem to get that message. And this is one of the things that we talked about that was a concern, of course, during the by-election that just happened a couple of weeks ago. When Poilievre returns, is he going to be not necessarily a chastised man, but is he going to be changed? Has he learned from this? Has he matured as a politician and as a public figure? Well, the short answer, based on the way he's acted for the last couple of weeks, is no. He's just being Poilievre. And I know there are people on the far right that just love that. They can hardly wait for him to get back in there and say, Poilievre, be Poilievre. Well, according to Canadians, remember the survey that we talked about 2 weeks ago on the podcast, the majority of Canadians said they would be embarrassed if Pierre Poilievre was the prime minister of this country. All right? That's where he stands in the opinion of many, many Canadians right now. And to suggest that he wants to go down to Washington and try to get involved in these negotiations, these very, very difficult negotiations, scares the hell out of me. And it should scare the hell out of Canadians. We don't want you at the table, Mr. Poilievre. We don't want you understanding the American position. We don't want you presenting what you think is the Canadian position, because according to Canadians, they don't think you understand the Canadian position. But that's the whole thing with Poilievre, isn't it? And it's the problem he's always had. All right. Pierre Poilievre is the same as he was 6 months ago, 6 years ago. He has never let the truth get in the way of one of his salacious partisan rants. And that's not the sort of person we want representing this country during these very, very intense and very important negotiations. That's it for this edition of the podcast. Thanks, as always, for being with us. Always appreciate your participation in this. If you're watching on YouTube, by the way, don't forget to hit that notification bell. And please also the subscribe button, okay? We really want your support. We want to grow this podcast and continue this discussion. We need your support to be able to do that. Thanks to Madeline Kelly, as always, for the great work putting this one together. Until next time, I'm Bill Kelly. Stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.